afternoon. Angry Moderate. I mean, it might not be the afternoon for you. It's the afternoon for me. It's a beautiful afternoon in lovely Hanover, New Hampshire, August 29th, 2012. The Angry Moderate. Out by the co-op. There's the co-op over there. We could get some organic produce and some rice at $9 a bag. There's the soccer fields of Dartmouth College. Off in the distance, you can hear the yells of athletic participation on the soccer fields. There's the gas station behind me with its unleaded gasoline at $4 a gallon. There's education taking place at the high school yonder and further off, etc. Well, you get the picture. Beautiful Hanover, New Hampshire, the hub of the universe, the intellectual center of the Upper Valley, and quite possibly of all of New Hampshire. Here we are, Angry Moderate, broadcasting live from the parking lot of the co-op. The parking lot is not necessarily the intellectual hub of the universe, but I don't know. I mean, I would think that here at the co-op, I could engage in any number of intellectual conversations by people going to buy their food. Anyway, Angry Moderate, August 29th, 2012, and there's a great deal to talk about, isn't there? Because it is the Republican National Convention. Whoa. Anyway, I'm a moderate, right down the middle politically. I tend to try and stay away from becoming ideologically predisposed to either extreme. And one of the reasons for that is that I think that when people become extreme left or extreme right, they're no longer are thinking, they're just reacting. That there may be an analysis. I mean, people who are way out on the left may have a very, very specific political analysis, as do people on the right side of the political spectrum may have spent a lot of time considering their position. But I think that what happens is that the position becomes very dogmatic based upon affiliation, like an affiliation with people who they see as like-minded, a community-ness, a community spiritedness, a sense of belonging, right? So when I was in college, I liked to go to Grateful Dead concerts, and it was my religion, if you will. And why did I go to Grateful Dead concerts? Was the music great? Well, the music was great, but more importantly was the community, were the people that you could have similar conversations with, most of whom you held similar values with. There weren't a lot of people going to Grateful Dead concerts who held real disparate values. There tended to be a fairly interesting and rather liberal take on things. And back during my college days, I think that liberalism was my creed. And anyway, I did it for the community, right? I was part of Grateful Dead-ism to a great extent for the community-ness, and heading to Dead shows and hanging out in the parking lot and talking about all the songs that the band was going to play, ya-la-la-la. So I think that to a certain extent, when people affiliate themselves politically and become very dogmatic about their political affiliations, it has to do with wanting to be part of something, which is, here's a bigger conversation, which for me seems anathema to being able to use my front brain, right? Like, I want to be able to reason. I want to be able to look at all of the different information and data and then make a decision. Whenever I'm looking at data, I'm always looking down, because data is always down here, right? I want to look down at the data. I want to look at the data and then make an analysis based upon information, and not based upon dogmatism, not based upon lack of analysis, not based upon sort of this reactive thinking. I want to look at all the information and make a decision. And I think when people get caught in extremes, whether they be political extremes on the right or political extremes on the left, they're no longer making decisions based upon front brain thinking. They're part of a group. And I'll tell you, like, read some doom and gloom blogs, right? Read the blogs of people either way out on the right or way out on the left who are about doom and gloom, economic catastrophe, etc. And if you read those every day, you can get sucked right in. And then you start, like, putting little blog posts or little, the comment area, and everybody's like, yeah, right? And people are all, get fired up, and, oh, that was a great comment, Dan, and all of a sudden you feel like you're part of something, and no longer are you sitting there with taking a step back and saying, well, this and maybe this and maybe that, and I could be wrong, etc., all of a sudden this absolutism leads to a feeling of belonging. And I think that actually, if we study it from a neuroscience standpoint, you would see, endorphins get fired because people feel like they are belonging to something, and the dopamine is flowing, and so it strikes me as somewhat natural that people would affiliate themselves with political parties and extreme groups because it probably feels good. And yet I listen to the party platform, the planks that comprise the platform. What a great political metaphor. All of the planks that comprise the party platform of the Republican Party, and I'm astounded. I'm astounded at what this party has become. The recent statements about abortion and the recent statements about same-sex marriage, as reflected in the party platform of the Republican Party, adamant with regard to no abortion, zero, none, and with regard to no acceptance of same-sex marriage, is somewhat stunning, because I bet that if you took 16,000 Republicans who are part of this committee, if you took all these folks and you got them individually, and you, instead of being part of a group, you had a long process, not of deprogramming, mind you, but of conversations about these issues, that you'd find that once they were taken out of that milieu, once they were taken out of that reinforcing, that feedback loop type of environment, that they wouldn't be so adamant about their position, that they would probably be a little bit more willing to say, hey, well, maybe I'm wrong. But in that environment, there's no room for admission of any kind of fallibility. It's really, interestingly, frightening. Now, I would also argue, I would posit the following argument, because I am in Hanover, New Hampshire, at Dartmouth College, so I'm going to try and sound erudite, right? So I'm going to posit an argument, as opposed to just, making an argument. Yeah, I'm going to make a point and see what, yeah. Instead, I'm going to posit an argument. I'm going to present my thesis. I would argue that evolutionarily, 7 syllables, I would argue that with regard to evolution, right, and the evolution of human beings, and with regard to the survival of human beings, that it is built into us, it is hardwired into us to have people who are leaders and people who are followers. That we are hardwired for some of us to be leaders and hardwired for some of us to be followers, because probably back in caveman days, many millennia ago, way back, you had to have, Og, who was the head of tribe, and he was going to kill Mammoth, and all of the others were like, yay, Og, right? Because you had to follow. You had to have leaders, and you couldn't have all leaders, because they would be arguing about who was going to go out and kill the mammoth, and then it would get really cold and they'd all freeze to death. And you'd find them in the ice sculptures, frozen in time. Do you hear that dog? See the size of that dog? There's a dog in a car over there. I could turn the camera and show you. This dog is the size of the car itself. This is not a dog. This is a bear in dog's clothing. Anyway, so you would have all these cave people frozen in these ice, arguing with each other about who was going to go kill the mammoth. So you have to have, we evolve to have leaders and followers. It's hardwired. Evolve may not be the perfect word, but it is hardwired into our genetic whatever, that you have the folks who are the charismatic, the Ogs of the world, and then you have the ones who are at the Republican National Convention going, yay! Cheering when the Republican guys get up there and make their, speeches that are only half-truths and a lot of, rhetoric. Now, no, don't get me wrong. I don't think that the Democrats have any monopoly on the truth. I don't think that the Democrats get up there at their convention and they're like, well, we're telling the truth and the Republicans are lying, and that I would believe that. Because as an angry moderate, I'm skeptical about both sides. Now, I'm not cynical. This is an important distinction to draw. Cynicism is like, they're all out to get us. It's like that guy, remember the cartoon Gulliver's Travels, and there was that dude Glum, we're doomed, we're never going to make it, right? I'm not cynical, I'm just skeptical. I'm skeptical as to the veracity of what is being put forward by the right, and I'm skeptical as to the veracity of what's being put forward by the left. just think that both sides get it wrong most of the time. And the reason both sides get it wrong most of the time is because they're caught up in ideology and they're not looking at information. They're not looking just at data. They are not stepping back and saying, okay, here's the information in front of me and I'm just going to figure it out. It's like being a poker player and simply looking at the information and making objective decisions hand to hand, as opposed to emotional. You know, from what I understand in poker, I'm a very bad poker player, right? I'm the guy you want at your poker game, right? I'm the guy, I'm just terrible, right? But from what I understand in poker, there's this thing called going on tilt, where if you lose, like if somebody loses a hand in poker, then they become really upset and like, oh, how could I have lost that hand? And they're like pulling their hair out, and so then they just start betting carelessly, and they're not looking at data anymore. Then they're just like off, you know. It's like, you know, you hit a wing nut, the nut, you know, what are those things? Wing nuts, right? That go flying up in the air. So, back to political extremism, back to the Republican National Committee Convention. The Republican National Convention, which is taking place in Tampa, Florida, as I speak, it has become you know, well, it always was. These conventions have always been big cheerleading events. But what's interesting is that as the Republican Party gets further and further, moves further and further to the right and becomes more conservative, I would make the argument that it's not necessarily about a real true adherence and belief in that ideology. It's just because if you're not moving in that direction, you don't get the same adrenaline rush. If you're not moving in that extreme right-wing direction, the endorphins aren't firing the way they're firing for the people who are so adamant and so sure about themselves. That's what's, to me, so very fascinating, because I'm sure, to be honest with you, that the majority of the people at the Republican National Convention are lovely people, fine human beings. I have no problem with them. My values are probably different than their values. I have different values when it comes to the issue of abortion. I have different values when it comes to the issue of same-sex marriage. But I'm sure that they're fine people. What's interesting is that in that group, in that aggregate, in that environment, to be moderate is to be on the outside looking in, and therefore you're not getting the dopamine rush from being part of the crowd. And it's so fascinating, because in my opinion, one of the things that has marked American politics to a great extent since the formation of the nation, back in the late 18th century, was that we are politically, or have been, a rather relatively moderate nation. Do you like the film noir here with you've got the speckled light, it's, like, what was it, Double Indemnity with the scenes behind the curtain, or through the, hello, Clarice. But, the United States has been a country marked by a somewhat of a moderate political environment. Yeah, there have been times where there's been extreme sentiment expressed on both sides of the spectrum. But for the most part, we're not like other countries when there's some kind of a disagreement about something, that people are hitting the streets and smashing stuff and blowing up. That tends to be very rare in the United States. And what's interesting to me at this point in our history, whatever, is that we have moved, in my opinion, away from that moderate discourse. And here's the thing, and here's where here's where I would, another B. No, it's the same B. Here's where I would disagree with the people who analyze politics and social discourse. I think that the majority of scientists or folks, whatever, theorists who talk about this time that we're in, we're in this great time of, extremism in the United States, or the dialogue is not there. There are two sides on the aisle, on either side of the aisle in the Senate and the House, and they can't walk across the aisle and shake each other's hands. And I don't think it's because of intractable views about issues. I think it's the other way around. That the tail wagging the dog idea. I think it's because as the momentum has been gained by people on the right, for example, not people on the right, people on the extreme. Let's talk about the Tea Party. As the Tea Party has gained momentum, being part of that environment, being part of that community, has become exciting and empowering. And so you have more people who become part of that group, that topic, that discussion, that environment, not because they necessarily adhere to these ideologies based upon reason, based upon thinking, but because it feels good. It feels good. It feels good. It feels good for them to be at this, convention, jumping up and down and cheering because all of their friends are doing it. And all of their comrades. They wouldn't like me saying comrade, right? They'd be like, no, no, no. Don't do comrades here. We're on the political right. It is the left who does comrades. But you get the point. It's because they're part of something together. And that thing that they are part of continues to move to the right and become more extreme, because extremism by its very nature is more adamant and more dogmatic and more belligerent and therefore more exciting and more invigorating. And in a time of economic duress, 4 years of terrible recession, unemployment still, the real unemployment rate, how they talk about, the fictitious and the real. When we talk about real unemployment, we're talking about unemployment that includes people who've given up looking for jobs, people who are underemployed, people who'd like to be full-time but are part-time, with a real unemployment rate of well over 10, 11, 12%. These are tough times. And people even who have jobs may not have the jobs that they want. Maybe they have a PhD and they're working, at the co-op. Maybe they don't want to be working at the co-op. And nothing against the co-op, I'm just pointing out an issue. And so you end up they have to find ways to feel happy. And one of the ways that you feel happy is when you have, at a very basic neurological level, is when the dopamine is going and the endorphins are going. And how do people find that sometimes? By affiliating themselves with groups of people in ways that may not be so terrific. Look at hooliganism in soccer in Europe. Well, he jumped from politics to soccer. That's because they're not incredibly different. Hooliganism is a fascinating thing because all these hooligans who ride up and down on the trains and drink their beer and get into fights, why do they do it? Do they do it because they really love their soccer teams? No, it's a soccer team. They do it because it gives them community. It gives them something when times are tough in other parts of their lives. Most of the time, hooliganism tends to grow during more difficult economic times. During times when other parts of somebody's life isn't necessarily, fabulous. Angry Moderate, August 29th, 2012, sitting outside on a beautiful pre-autumn day. Still summer, but it has that fall feeling in the air, the sun is starting to get that kind of, that goldeny as opposed to that hazy summer look. It's gorgeous. I'm out here at the co-op. I'm going to go to the co-op after recording this Angry Moderate episode. I'm going to go to the co-op. I'm going to spend money that is more money than I should spend on food, but I like the food at the co-op. I'm going to get some rice and some veggies, and I'm going to cook a stir-fry tonight, maybe a little tofu. Do you think people on the political right eat tofu? I think they do. Anyway, so my point is that as we look at the Republican National Convention, as those people on the left who are watching the show, hello, if you're liberal and you're watching this show, Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital's up that way, and there's an ambulance heading up there. If you're on the left, if you are, identify yourself as a liberal or, a leftist or a commie, if you're a commie, and you're watching this show, I would urge you, not to look at the Republican National Convention as a hotbed of disgusting ideology, but I would urge you to look at it as a place where people are, a lot of them, trying to find somewhere to feel good, somewhere where the endorphins are filing the endorphins under E in my endorphin files, where the neurological response to being part of a community is that they feel better, and also that this time of year, every 4 years, whatever, with regard, we just had the Olympics, now we have the election, people are prone to fall into their characteristics, their avenues of either leader or follower, right? And so followers, people who are, I think, just hardwired to be the people in the audience cheering, hey, right? Those people, this is a good time for them. It's good when you're of that, cheerleading kind of mindset, and that's where you are. It's beautiful out today. If that's where you are as a human being, these are the times where you feel best, because there are issues and there are candidates and there are debates and there's discussion and it's exciting, and the more extreme the debate becomes and the more exciting it becomes and the more demonstrative it becomes and the more involved you become, the better you feel. So eat those beans at every meal. Sorry. Anyway, my encouragement, my hope is that people on the political left won't look at the Republican National Convention and the people who have voted against, totally put into the Republican Party platform anti-abortion, anti-same-sex marriage, and say these people are all bigots and these people are all opposed to women's autonomy, the women's rights. I don't think that's the case. I think to a great extent it's rear brain thinking, it's reactive thinking. I think that it's people being part of something where they're wanting to belong, and I honestly do not believe that, like I did when I was younger, that people on the political extremes are lost causes. I don't think that. I think they have found something, they're attached to that something, they are attached to it because they have found camaraderie in that attachment, and it's making them feel good in the near term, but I don't think in the long term there will be a caveat to this, that is going to express itself in a way that's going to move toward legislation and other kinds of actions that are so very the antithesis of what we would consider to be part of sort of the importance of living in a democratic state, democratic institutions. Now, I will say this caveat. We have seen throughout history societies that continue to move in an extreme direction, and if a charismatic leader, if some leader comes to power and is able to tap into that and exploit that during a difficult time, then it can all go to heck, right? I mean, then it can really fall apart, and you can have absolute mass horrible tragedy and just, the worst of times. And to be honest with you, I don't see Mitt Romney as that guy. I just don't. And again, I consider myself a political moderate. If you were to say, do you lean more to the left or more to the right? I lean more to the left. I lean a little bit to the liberal side. When it comes to same-sex marriage, I'm like, yeah, fine, it's great. Two people love each other, get married, great. Can I come to the wedding? Right? I mean, in terms of a woman's right to choose, yeah, absolutely. Those are my values. My values have always been on the side of a woman's right to choose. That's just how I grew up. But I don't see the political establishment on the political right as characterized by the possible Romney presidency as being belligerently right-wing. I think that if Romney became president, that you would see a movement toward the middle because economically there would have to be a movement toward the middle because there's no way you could carry out the Paul Ryan and Romney current economic idea and actually continue to have real economic, have any kind of hope for the economic future, midterm and long term. But I also think that right now there's a lot of excitement around sort of hyper-conservative views or hyper-conservative ideation, but it's mostly because it's a way for people to feel like they belong, that they're part of something. And I don't think that in the long term it has a lot of legs. My opinion. Angry Moderate, August 29th, 2012, on an absolutely beautiful day. Look, they're playing, you can't see it, but I can see it. They're playing soccer over there. It must be the Dartmouth College men's team practicing on their soccer field, and up behind me is the part of the Appalachian Trail. Like when the light is coming through all the trees and you have all the different shades of green and the leaves are rustling in the wind. It's really, actually, kind of a beautiful place to live. I mean, I have lived, the Angry Moderate, me, Dan Weintraub, has lived in a number of places. Lived in the California desert, lived in Texas, lived in New York. Not my favorite, though I love New York City. But I must say that Hanover, New Hampshire and the Upper Valley, very, very beautiful place in which to live and to ply one's trade. In any event, let's talk more about the current economic situation, the current economic environment, something in my throat, and how that plays into the dialogue, the arguments that are being put forward by the political establishment and by the political candidates. And I say this almost for every episode. Every episode of The Angry Moderate, I say, in some way or another, you have to understand economics at a truly, not only at a foundational level, but you have to understand it at a very granular level. You have to understand economics from the perspective of what's the difference between private debt and public debt. You have to understand when a country is on a commoditized standard, like a gold standard, versus when a country has a fiat currency, a currency that is irredeemable, that can be created at will. You have to understand how a central bank works. You have to understand how bond markets work and how equities markets work. To really, oh, there's that bee again. To really, wouldn't it be great if I was filming The Angry Moderate here, right? It's like blah, 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 and I got stung by the bee, right? That would be quite entertaining for you in cable access TV land. Whenever, by the way, I think of cable access TV, I always think of who? Wayne's World. Wayne's World, party time, excellent. Wayne's World. So it's so fantastically important to understand economics, that those, all of the nuances of economic policy, fiscal policy, of the financialization of our economic system. And as I've said many times, that there are so many arguments being put forth in the media and by supposed experts on both sides that miss an extraordinarily important distinction that needs to be drawn. There are those on the political right who argue for austerity, that we have to cut spending on entitlement programs, and that we have to cut spending on education, and that we have to cut back on benefits for unions, and we have to do all these things because we're in so much debt. And there are people on the left who say we must become a state like a European state that supports the population, 300 plus million people, 100 million people living at or right at or below the poverty level. I mean, extraordinary difficulties. And both sides make their arguments without, in my opinion, a real granular understanding of how money works, And I'm just going to make 3 quick points. One, you have to understand that all money in the common era nowadays is created based upon the extension of credit. And one of the things that you need to be aware of is that we have gone through, in the last 30 years, one of the biggest credit booms, credit expansions in the history of history. All money is created based upon the extension of credit. When you go to the bank and you say, I want to buy this used car and it costs $10,000, and they say, okay, we'll lend it to you, they create that money out of thin air. They type $10,000 into your account. They have the permission to do that from the government and from the central bank, from the Federal Reserve. And when that money is created, there are many ideas behind the creation of that money that economists believe helps keep the economy moving. Velocity of money, all sorts of sort of arcane economic issues. When you go through a period of time where you have an expansion of credit and you have a system in which banks are able to leverage trillions of dollars in credit to make money for themselves, but all of that credit is chasing a very small, limited amount of actual assets or actual capital, then you end up putting yourself in a position where the federal government oftentimes has to come in, or is going to have to come in, or has come in with, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program as one example, and bail out these banks that have basically piled on one another in a Ponzi-like scheme where they've bought into this expansion, this credit expansion, as a way to make money in the short term without an ability to repay those private debts in the long term. But there's a real distinction that needs to be drawn between private and public debt. Again, when people argue on the political right that we have to have a balanced budget and that we need to not be deficit spending, that is erroneous. It's not true. Any money that's spent in deficit by the government, if the government spends $1 billion, that $1 billion in a pure accounting form is spent by the government, hopefully on something that the country needs, whether that be unemployment insurance, whether that be the defense budget, who knows? I'm willing to stipulate, even though during the time that they were prosecuted, I was opposed to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I'm willing to stipulate that perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps those wars were necessary for the defense of the nation. To be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. But you have to understand that deficit spending by its very nature is not necessarily catastrophic, because we as a nation with the most power, with the most powerful economic force in the world, and with the ability to open the monetary spigots when we need to and then close them when things start to move too fast, we have that ability as a nation based upon us having an irredeemable currency. Now, a lot of people would argue, yes, but when you do that, you create very difficult, you create a lot of instability in the markets. And I would argue, yes, there's a certain amount of truth to that. When you monetize $500 billion in debt, that money can create instability in the marketplace. But here's the reason why, and I've said this many times, and if anything, if you get anything from my, jabbering, the angry moderates blabbering on, which I do ad nauseum, right, is this: it's not the ability to print money that is problematic. It is the rules behind it and who has access to it that's problematic. It's the fact that Henry Paulson and his government, his surrounding cadre of folks back in 2008 convinced our Congress that $750 billion needed to be used to bail out Wall Street, not to in any way mitigate what Wall Street had done in their huge Ponzi schemes with regard to securitization, with regard to the housing market, even with regard to the internet bubble of some 15 years earlier. 10 years earlier, there was no effort on the part of economists and the government to examine how we do this money printing. Why? What are our values? What do we believe is the way in which this money, who should have access to this money, and how should these monies be used? That's the essential issue here. The issue is less that we have a fiat currency. The issue is more that when $750 billion are created to bail out Wall Street, it leaves people like me and you, if you're in the middle class, kind of in a quandary, because we walk over to the co-op right over there, right? And we spend $85 and we walk out with 2 bags. Because the price of commodities gets bid up by those people who have access to the monies, because the monies go to the banks use those monies to invest, or to not only invest themselves, but to invest in funds which are supposed to, and you end up having a growing disparity between people who are in that top echelon financially and people, the rest of us, right? Now, here's another question that you kind of think you need to examine. Maybe this is the best, this is the way it should be. Like, stick with me on this one. And again, I've said this before. You've probably heard me say this before. Unless you've never seen me before, in which case you've never heard me say this before, and you might be changing the channel right now because you don't want to hear me say it. Maybe it's better to live in a system in which you have billionaires, many billionaires, and hundreds of thousands of millionaires, and then a lot of people who are poor, because maybe it raises the standard of living for everybody. Maybe it's better to be poor in the United States in a sort of crony capitalist system, a system in which there's a lot of insider everything, right? Which it just is. Maybe it's better to live in that kind of a system than to have some sort of a big revolution or reform in which all of a sudden you are finding that the wealthy are being taxed at 70 or 80%, and they're socialized medicine, la 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 la. I don't know the answer to that. Again, that's a values-based argument, a values-based assessment that you have to make. You have to decide, is it better to live in a society that is in which the rule of law? I mean, let's be honest here, right? The rule of law doesn't really exist for the rich. The rich are able to subvert the rule of law for their own benefit. I give you the simplest of examples, and 2 people get arrested for the same crime. The rich guy gets to bail himself out and gets to sit on the beach while he awaits trial, and the poor guy sits in prison and awaits trial. So there are inequities. Democratic institutions and democratic ideals are subverted by inequities in wealth. They just are. I mean, let's just admit it. When you have inequities in wealth, when you have a super wealthy class and you have poverty, you have democratic ideals that are subverted by that. Just, it is what it is. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay to have a system, a government, a society in which democratic ideals take a back seat to economic power, I don't know, because we haven't gotten to the point in the United States where we've had our big, revolution, and all of a sudden there's been a turning on the people with wealth, and we haven't had that, have we? And here I am, let's be honest, here I am sitting in front of the co-op. I'm about to walk into the co-op. I'm going to walk up and down the rows of the co-op, shopping for all kinds of great food, right? I'm wearing a nice shirt. I have a good job. My car right here. I have a nice little car, right? Live in a nice apartment. Still middle class. But is it because I live in the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world that I'm able, even as someone who struggles to make ends meet, that I'm able to have a better standard of living than people in other parts of the world who might find themselves in a similar economic circumstance in relationship to the wealth and poverty scales in their nation? Again, I'm not saying that I'm not sitting here arguing that, yeah, it's great to live in a country in which you've got a lot of rich people, a lot of Mr. Potters who pull all the strings and who buy elections with their super PACs. I love that. I'm not saying that. I'm not, that's not my argument. My argument is, maybe it's better this way. I don't know. What's interesting about our current election, what's interesting about the election that is being contested, our federal election, right, between Mitt Romney, the presumptive, or about to not, well, he's no longer presumptive, is he? The Republican nominee for president and his vice presidential running mate, Paul Ryan, and on the left, or on, the Democrat, Barack Obama, and his vice president, Joe Biden. What's interesting about that election right now is that what's interesting to me is that the right, again, is painting it as, if you listen to them, that Barack Obama, is fundamentally trying to change the shape, the face of the United States, that he's trying to Europeanize the United States, that he's trying to, welfareize the United States. And there's this clamor on the right in opposition to the policies, the economic policies of Barack Obama. When I look at the Obama presidency and I look at who he hired as his folks, his folks that surrounded him with regard to monetary, Tim Geithner, Dartmouth grad, and, former Fed, he was the head of the New York Fed, right? And all these folks who were part of Goldman Sachs, all of these, Bob Rubin, Harvard, Goldman Sachs, it's not like he has diverged or swayed too far from the status quo. In my analysis, it's not like he has moved too far to the left economically. I don't see but I think what the right has done is that the right finds again, I'm coming full circle now. I think what the right finds so lovely, for lack of a better word, so invigorating, so reassuring about their arguments about President Obama is that it makes them feel good to be able to paint a picture of this guy as being a would-be socialist, or a socialist wannabe, or someone who wants to change fundamentally the face of the United States. Just like many people on the left between 2000 and 2008 looked at George W. Bush, the presidency of Bush the Younger, and could not believe what was happening with regard to, for example, the doctrine of preemption, that George Bush unilaterally created this doctrine of preemption where now we were going to go out into the world instead of trying to contain. Remember, we had a doctrine of containment with communism. Now we were going to preempt any attacks on the United States by killing them first. So I think that both sides find a great deal of comfort and a great deal of communityness, community spiritedness. I mean, this is not the right word. They feel good about being able to paint the other side as being somehow way, way, way out and trying to change the, doing things that are just nefarious. And one final example. There's so much clamor and so much gnashing of teeth and pulling out of hair on the right about President Obama's use of executive orders, like where he signs executive signing orders, where he bypasses Congress to create these orders, and George W. Bush, dozens and dozens of the same events. I mean, if you go back and you look at the Bush presidency, did the same thing. And people on the left, same pulling out of hair, same gnashing of teeth, same absolute, couldn't believe that we were letting this man get away with the de-democratization of the United States. So you have people on the right who look at the Obama administration as being anti-democratic, and you have people on the left who looked at the Bush administration as being anti-democratic. You have people on the left who look at our inequities in our wealth, the wealth and the way banking works and the extension of credit and debt, etc., as being anti-democratic. You have people on the right, there's that B again, who look at redistribution of wealth and the welfare state and as being anti-democratic, and everybody is arguing that the other side is anti-democratic. And I would probably that's true. Probably everything that happens, unless it's right down the middle, is somehow a little bit anti-democratic. But I think that most of the arguments are made because, again, coming back to the beginning of this whole conversation, or this whole diatribe, people associate themselves with groups of people because it gives them a sense of community, and it makes them feel empowered, and it neurologically, if you look at the neuroscience of it, the endorphins, whatever, dopamine, adrenaline, I don't know all of the actual physiological processes that take place, but I know that when I'm part of a group, like when I used to go see the Grateful Dead, and we're like, dancing and hippies in the parking lot, Sugar Magnolia, right? When we're hanging out like that, you feel good, not just because you're in the parking lot dancing to Sugar Magnolia, because that's a little weird, but because everybody else is doing it too. And you feel kind of good about the fact that you're part of that. So, anyway, Angry Moderates, August 29th, 2012. That's about all I have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week. Bye.